Will India be an economic superpower? There are many aspects to being a global superpower. Military, cultural, that being soft power, scientific. Economic is just one of many aspects. And in this video, I want to tackle whether India will be an economic superpower specifically. From the time most of us are children, our parents, grandparents, media tell us this story as though it is inevitable that India will be a superpower one day. But it seems that this day has been coming soon for decades now. India's ascent to economic superpower status seems to be going slower than that lopsided container truck that drives on the fast lane of our national highways. Aparna Pandey, director of the Hudson Institute's program on the future of India and South Asia. The Hudson Institute is a powerful US think tank that influences American elites and policy. She said, quote, "We believe we will become a great power, but we also believe we don't really need to work to become one. It is our right to be one. And my concerns are that we believe we will become one without doing anything. And actually, we seem to be moving backward." So she thinks India is moving the other way. Other people have said similar things from India. Ramachandra Guha, prominent Indian intellectual, said, "There are too many fault lines in our society to be a superpower." As a historian, I say, we are not prepared. As an Indian citizen, I say, we should not even attempt to. So he thinks we should not even try to be a superpower. So who's right? Is it all our parents, grandparents, media, and many others who say India is moving towards superpower status? Or is it these naysayers who say that India is not going in that direction and even might be going backwards? In this video, I'm going to give you the lay of the land of India's trajectory based on where it was in the year 2000, where it is today, a quarter of a century later, and where it is going towards roughly the mid-century when India turns 100 in 2047. Where this country is headed is important for the world, for 18% of humanity lives in this country. I assure you, you'll come out of this video with a clearer picture of where the Indian economy is headed, and by way of that, where the world is headed to. Generally, when people talk about the economy of a country, they talk about its GDP. This is your consumption plus net exports plus government expenditure plus gross investment. In the year 2000, India's nominal GDP was at $500 billion. Today it's at about $4 trillion, sitting at a firm fourth place globally, with third place more or less guaranteed in the next 3 or so years. If you count all the money that India doesn't report to the government, the GDP is already probably at 35 trillion and India is number 1. Am I right? In the next 25 years, if things go the way they have for the last 25, India will be somewhere in the ballpark of $30 trillion of GDP, depending, of course, on inflation. This will place it firmly in the top 3, along with the USA and China also being roughly the same order of magnitude. But all this GDP stuff is quite basic. You can find this information all over the news and on many YouTube channels already. You've come here for more than that. And that's what I'm going to give you in this video. We are going to look at geography, land, rail, road, ports, and trade in an effort to build a more clear picture of where India is headed in 25 years. Now, the first thing to start with is that India is the most populous nation on Earth. When it comes to economic activity, the number of hands and brains that you have to work with is extremely important, naturally so. And with all these teeming millions, India has the opportunity to connect these people digitally and with infrastructure. And the better you can connect these people to one another, the more India can harness its ability and its potential to become a superpower. And the way you connect people is via infrastructure are like the arteries of a country. They pump material, goods, and people through the country. They allow people to travel far away to find jobs that they're more suited for. They can still visit home. And it also fosters a sense of cultural unity and national identity. This is why when you have very mountainous regions, you often find different cultures that sometimes don't like each other and war with each other because they don't have a way to connect. So they end up speaking different languages and fighting each other often. This is why Papua New Guinea, for example, is extremely diverse in terms of its linguistic landscape. And this is also as you cross mountains in, say, the northwest of the Indian subcontinent or even the northeast, you end up not only having different languages, but different language families. There is no cultural unity. The way to bridge this cultural unity is with infrastructure. But we're not going to talk about cultural unity in this video. We're going to talk about infrastructure as an economic tool instead. Now, the better your network, the lower the cost of transporting goods in your country, which means it also brings down the cost of selling those goods for retailers, which means it's cheaper for consumers, which means that consumers have more disposable income that they can either invest or spend elsewhere. So infrastructure, good infrastructure, naturally increases your GDP. And it also grows exports because it makes it cheaper to manufacture goods in your country versus in another country somewhere else. This is why the economic manufacturing superpower of the world, China, has so many roads. If you look at a map of China, just look at Google Maps of China, you'll see an insanely dense road network there that you don't really see in any other country at this density and quality. This is why the Chinese have a proverb, if you want to get rich, build a road first, because they did it, and that's why they know. Now, in terms of infrastructure, there are different networks that you can build. The most efficient of any infrastructure is... Now, even though I'd like to believe that India is the greatest land on earth for everything, it's actually not true. Okay? India is very good for some things, but in other ways, it's quite poor. One of these ways is in waterways. You might say, why are waterways so important? Now, to put it simply, if you apply a certain amount of energy to an object, it moves furthest by water. Water is more efficient than land. It costs about 1.1 rupees to transport 1 ton by water. It costs 1.5 by rail and 3 by road. This is why ocean shipping dominates the world, not land transport. It's just because it's much cheaper than anything else. And this doesn't account for trains or cars being constantly stopped by cattle, signal failures, or bureaucratic checks in India. Am I right? Now, the regions of the world with scalable inland waterways lend their geography to creating economic superpowers. There are some regions of the world that have great inland waterways, and they also happen to be extremely prosperous. You have the Rhine River Delta in Germany, you have the Yangtze and Yellow Rivers in China, you have the Mississippi in the United States. These are all extremely rich regions. India has none at scale. India has about 5,000 kilometers of inland waterways that are capable of running mechanized ships, compared to the US's 41,000 kilometers and China's 65,000 kilometers. Even countries that have no superpower ambitions per se, like say Vietnam, Brazil, have larger mechanizable inland waterway systems than India. Now, of course, the government knows this and has declared another 20,000 or so kilometers of inland waterways to be developed in India. But even if executed to perfection, this will still place India firmly of the 3 superpowers of the world in the future, the US, China, and India. India will be in a far distant 3rd place. This is also partially because of the nature of India's blessed land to begin with, the monsoon. India's water doesn't constantly flow the same way through the year. During the monsoon, rivers surge, enabling water transportation. But during the dry season, many of those rivers just dry up and you wouldn't be able to run reliable transportation without it potentially getting stuck in a river somewhere. So this blessing of India's monsoon means that India may get world-class crop yields and predictable rainfall, but the barges carrying that crop would end up sitting in a village parking lot for 6 months until the next monsoon. Another way to look at inland waterway usage is via cargo tonnage. India is at about 145 million tons. By 2047, India could be at roughly 500 million tons transported annually, but again, this would still place India firmly in the last place of the future global economic superpowers, with no hope of catching up in this domain specifically. But all hope is not lost. India has other infrastructure to rely on, that being rail is a little bit more expensive, but is still competitive. Now, the metric that we'll use for rail is freight ton kilometers per year. Now, freight ton kilometers per year is transporting 1 ton by freight rail in a year. Here, India is at a distant 4th place currently, at about 1 trillion per year, compared with China's 3.5 trillion, Russia's 2.6 trillion, and the USA's 2.1 trillion. Russia is on this list because Russia is mostly landlocked, and especially to trade domestically with itself, rail is really the only option that they have. It's not like Vladivostok and St. Petersburg can trade easily by ship. You may as well transport things by rail, especially to the Russian hinterland. Now, India is moving extremely fast in this domain. In the year 2000, India was only at 300 billion freight tons per year. So this is a 3x increase over 25 years. And it's safe to say that with the upgrades the government is making to the rail system, for example with the dedicated freight corridors, that India will be able to achieve number 1 or number 2 in freight rail by 2047, depending on how China does going forward. But there are some places where even rail cannot go, and for that you need roads are the least efficient of the 3 modes of transport, except of course for air, which is its own thing. Traveling by road is about 1.5 times more expensive than traveling by rail, sometimes 2 times more expensive, sometimes more, depending on the terrain. But roads are still important because roads are flexible. Now, when it comes to just any roads, India already has the largest road network on Earth at 6 million kilometers. This is because India is entirely populated. Every village needs a road. Whereas when you look at some other countries like Russia, it's not like it's so densely populated throughout the country that you need roads everywhere. However, most roads in India are only fit for local transport. India's next step will be to upgrade as many of its roads as it can, and also roads that would be efficient to do so this way, into highways and eventually controlled access expressways. Highways are good for everyone except maybe the vehicle maintenance business that kept repairing your tires after you went into potholes, am I right? I'm joking, of course. Even those businesses will do better because more people will be able to afford cars. Now, in the year 2000, India had about only a few hundred kilometers of access-controlled expressway. Today, India has 6,000 kilometers of access-controlled expressway, which is more than a 10x improvement. This places India at 9th place for access-controlled expressways today. If India is able to keep up this pace, by 2047, India will likely have the 3rd largest network of access-controlled expressways in the world. Now that we've covered infrastructure, let's move on to that next metric of measuring an economic superpower. If roads and rail are the arteries of a country, energy is the blood, with the power stations being the heart that pumps this blood across the country. In the year 2000, India had an installed power generating capacity of about 100 gigawatts. This doesn't mean that India uses this much, but just that it could, on a good day where the sun shines for solar and the wind blows for wind energy, and all the power plants of coal are being used at maximum capacity, could generate 100 gigawatts of power. Luckily, there's a metric to measure power usage. This is your watt hours. Simply put, it means if you use 1 gigawatt for 1 hour, that is 1 gigawatt hour. In the year 2000, India generated 500 terawatt hours of electricity. Today, India consumes or generates roughly 5 times as much, 2,000 terawatt hours per year. This already places India third in terms of power generation, behind only China and the United States. By the year 2047, India will generate roughly 5,000 terawatt hours, or thereabouts. This will mean that India will either match or surpass the United States in terms of power generation by the year 2047. So in terms of electricity, India's superpower status is all but guaranteed. Although in India, guaranteed electricity might mean that you still have to expect 1 hour of power failure every afternoon. I've lost way too many saved games as a result of power cuts. Let's move on to that other aspect. In the year 2000, India's annual global trade with the world was only $100 billion, meaning that for a country of its size, it barely traded with the world at all. Today, India's trade with the world is 17 times as much, or 10x accounting for inflation. But India still lags far behind other countries of the world in trade. The number one, China, has $6 trillion worth of trade annually. India is also behind the US's 5.5 trillion, and even most large European countries like, say, the UK, France, or Germany, which have a free trade zone and thus trade with each other a lot. Now, the Indian government has set a target for 2047 to trade worth $20 trillion annually. But this seems to me like an unrealistic goal. This would mean that in 2047, more than half of India's GDP would come from trade. Even China today, one of the most trading-heavy countries on earth and in history, has only $6 trillion worth of trade, which is hardly a quarter of its economy. What is going to happen on this front, I think, remains to be seen, but at the current growth rate of 7% annually, it would be safe to say that India will reach roughly where China and the USA are today by the year 2047, which would make it a trading superpower. Now, to handle a higher volume of trade, you need ports. 95% of India's trade by volume and 70% by value go by ocean. Much of the remaining 30% by value, I assume, goes by air. These are higher value items like, say, iPhones or jewelry or temperature-sensitive thermometers, for example. To add, the Indian subcontinent is surrounded by mountains and unfriendly states. So really, if India wants to develop its capacity for trade, it's only going to happen via ports and maritime expansion. Fortunately for India, it has a long coast jutting into the Indian Ocean, and because of its high population and influence, this region has always revolved around India, which is why it's the only ocean in the world named after a country. Now, in ancient times, India was a trading superpower, relying on the monsoon to trade with West Asia. In today's world, people don't need to wait for the wind. ULCVs, ultra-large container vessels, chug along the ocean against tide or wind. Now these ULCVs carry 20-foot containers. These are the standardized containers you see when you see these trading ships. And the metric that countries use to measure how much port trade they're doing is TEUs, 20-foot equivalent units. Now here's a chart of the top 10 countries by TEUs annually. In the year 2000, India had a TEU annual capacity of 2.5 million, placing it way down here. Today, it has a TEU annual capacity of 18 million. So this just tells you how underutilized India's port and maritime trading potential currently is. Now by 2047, both via the current annual growth rate and government targets, India will be at roughly 80 million TEUs annually, which will place it very squarely in the top 3 countries globally. So India is likely to become a trading country at least as influential as the United States, though perhaps not as influential as today's China, which sits at a whopping 300 million TEUs. And with that, we've covered all of the building blocks for increasing GDP and becoming an economic superpower, at least from the infrastructural side. Let's do a final tap. In physical infrastructure, things look largely positive. While inland waterways may be a disadvantage, India's rail and road journey is almost certain to place it into economic superpower status. In electricity generation, India is already at number 3 and can hope by 2047 to be number 2. And finally, in ports and trade, we'll see the largest transformation. India went from being not even in the top 10 in terms of TEUs, 20-foot equivalent units, in the year 2000, with a trajectory to place it firmly at number 2 or number 3 by the year 2047. And naturally, with all of this infrastructure, India will grow too. Indian GDP will go from being number 4 today to being number 3 within a couple of years, though still much smaller than the other 2 powers, to, by 2047, very likely making a rapid ascent and catching up with the United States and China. Based on all this data, it is clear that India's status as an economic superpower is all but guaranteed by the year 2047. Now, of course, anything can happen. A catastrophe or mismanagement can take India off this trajectory. But looking at how India has been doing for the last 25 years, and indeed since its independence, there is nothing to suggest that India would move off the track that it's currently on. If you're interested in tracking India's rise to superpower status in other fields, be it military, science, or anything else, let me know in the comments. I think India has a lot to look forward to. See you next time.